Hi, I'm Dave Palmer. Thanks for joining me on this video where we're going to talk about basically the sins of the flesh and how St. Thomas Aquinas answers them as far as there being mortal sins, and not only that, but why they are mortal sins. And of course, these all fall in the second part of the Summa, which is Secunda Secundae, as Thomas, first of all, goes through the theological virtues and all the virtues and vices associated with those. Then he goes into the cardinal virtues, and this would fall under temperance and the sins against temperance. And I'm just going to cover a few of them, gluttony, drunkenness, and also fornication in this video. And as this graphic shows, these are all based on original sin, which was the sin of our first parents, because they would not have had to deal with sins of the flesh before original sin, because they had perfect, Adam and Eve, that is, perfect integrity between reason and their passions or their desires. But of course, that was all lost with original sin, and now we deal with the consequences of it now, where we have a hard time keeping our passions and our desires in check, thanks to Adam and Eve and their original sin. All right, well, let's get to the first one, and that has to do with gluttony. It's one of the interesting, cardinal sins, deadly sins that people don't really talk about a whole lot. They might talk about overeating, but they don't, I don't think, confess it so much. You rarely hear any kind of homilies talking about this sin. At the same time, we live in a culture, at least here in America, where it's a restaurant culture with delicious food all the time. A lot of temptation to eat way too much. I know I suffer with that problem. And it doesn't help that you have all-you-can-eat buffets. I mean, who needs to eat all they can eat, for, $13.99 or something like that. So this is a constant temptation due to concupiscence to just eat too much, drink too much, just too much of food and drink. So Thomas's answer to this is pretty interesting, whether gluttony is a mortal sin. He says, accordingly, if the inordinate concupiscence in gluttony be found to turn man away from the last end, gluttony will be a mortal sin. Of course, the last end is God. It's our perfect happiness, beatitude, whatever you want to call it. This is the case when he adheres to the pleasure of gluttony as his end, for the sake of which he contemns God, being ready to disobey God's commandments in order to obtain those pleasures. On the other hand, if the inordinate concupiscence and the vice of gluttony be found to affect only such things as are directed to the end, not the end. For instance, when a man has too great a desire for the pleasures of the palate, yet would not for their sake do anything contrary to God's law, it is a venial sin. Isidore, comprising the first and second under one heading, when he says that the glutton exceeds in what he eats, or in how much he eats, how or when he eats. So there's different categories. If you're really picky and you only eat the best food, well, that could be gluttony. If you waste food or you eat too often, there's a lot of different ways to mortally sin when it comes to gluttony. But I think it has to be when somebody is willing to, eat in place of their, honor of God, where eating, as Scripture says, his belly is his God. And if we're willing to eat so much that we know it's a sin, but we're going to do it anyways, that's when it becomes a mortal sin. All right. The next one is drunkenness, and I think this is a big problem in our culture today. We live in a party culture, college campuses, revelry, licentiousness, and drunkenness is really, really common, unfortunately, in our culture today. And so Thomas says, is drunkenness a sin? Why is it a sin? Drunkenness is a mortal sin because then a man willingly and knowingly deprives himself of the use of reason, whereby he performs virtuous deeds and avoids sin, and thus he sins mortally by running the risk of falling into sin. For Ambrose says, we learn that we should shun drunkenness, which prevents us from avoiding grievous sins. For the things we avoid when sober, we unknowingly commit through drunkenness. Therefore, drunkenness, properly speaking, is a mortal sin. Thomas says the highest function of a human being is his reason. This is what separates us from all the other visible creatures on the earth. I think there's about 9 million species of creatures on the earth, visible creatures, and only one, the human being, has reason. And so this is a great gift that we've been given. And when somebody drinks to the point of drunkenness, they are intentionally giving up the very gift that distinguishes us from all the other creatures in the world. And so when we do that, we purposely dumb ourselves down, we become beastly. And as Thomas points out here, it also opens up the door. I mean, how often do people get drunk and then they fall into sexual sin, or they do stupid things, or drive recklessly and put other people's lives in danger? It all starts with drunkenness, because that is the gateway through which many other sins enter into a person's life. All right, how about fornication? Okay, this would be sex outside of marriage to unmarried people. That basically, again, unfortunately, very common in our culture today. And this answer is a little bit longer, but I'm delighted with how Thomas answers it, because he doesn't talk about, you can get a disease, or you could, all the things that we might, talk about, or you might bring a child into the world and I can't raise the child. He looks at it very much from the child's perspective, the potential life that could come from this union, right? He says, without any doubt, we must hold simple fornication to be a mortal sin. Okay, he's very adamant about this. In order to make this evident, we must take note that every sin committed directly against human life is a mortal sin. Now, simple fornication implies an inordinateness that tends to injure the life of the offspring to be born of this union. For we find in all animals, where the upbringing of the offspring needs care of both male and female, that these come together not indeterminately, but the male with a certain female, whether one or several. Okay, so when the male and the female are necessary, it's always one man to one female, exclusive to that relationship. Even in the animal world, he's saying. He's going to give some examples, such as the case with all birds, while on the other hand, among those animals where the female alone suffices for the offspring's upbringing, the union is indeterminate, as in the case of dogs and other animals, where you don't have one male dog mating with one female dog, because only the female is going to be raising the offspring. Okay, I don't know how true all this biology is, or this. He probably got this from Aristotle, which would have been quite old science. But anyways, now it is evident that the upbringing of a human child requires not only the mother's care for his nourishment, but more so the care of his father as guide and guardian, and under whom he progresses in goods both internal and external. Hence, human nature rebels against an indeterminate union of the sexes and demands that a man should be united to a determinate woman and should abide with her a long time, or even for a whole lifetime. Hence it is that in the human race, the male has a natural solicitude for the certainty of offspring, because on him devolves the upbringing of the child, and this certainly would cease if the union of sexes were indeterminate. So one man, one woman together, it's not, one man, fathering children with, 5 women, which unfortunately sometimes does happen, but that's not the way it should be. Okay, the last slide here. This union with a certain definite woman is called matrimony, which for the above reason is said to belong to the natural law. That means we don't have to be taught it. We know that a man should only be with one woman and a woman should only be with one man. Thomas is saying this doesn't have to be something taught to us by the church or scripture. We just know it naturally. Since, however, the union of the sexes is directed to the common good of the whole human race, and common goods depend on the law for their determination, it follows that this union of man and woman, which is called matrimony, is determined by some law. All right, so he's saying this isn't just a relationship between the man and the woman. This has a lot to do with the society at large, the stability, and we know that's the case. Wherefore, since fornication is an indeterminate union of the sexes as something incompatible with matrimony, it is opposed to the good of the child's upbringing, and consequently it is a mortal sin. Then he goes on to say, nor does it matter if a man having knowledge of a woman by fornication makes sufficient provision for the upbringing of the child, because a matter that comes under the determination of the law is judged according to what happens in general and not according to what may happen in a particular case. I think in this last paragraph, he's talking about a man who will take care of the child as far as providing money, providing the resources, but he's still not monogamous with that woman. And Thomas says, well, that's not going to fly. Okay. So I think when it comes to these sins of the flesh, the principles at hand here is that we have to follow reason, and we have to take human life into consideration. And then, as was the case with gluttony, we have to make sure that whatever desire it is that we are seeking, it does not take the place of our love of God and also in place of our final end. Okay, that'll do it. Thanks for watching. God bless you.